There's a house perched high in the Hollywood Hills, wrapped in ivy and cloaked in a permanent veil of shadow, even on the brightest days. This was once the home of Boris Karloff, the man who terrified generations as Frankenstein's monster. Today, the house still whispers his name. Locals call it cursed. Real estate agents refuse to list it, and for decades no one dared step inside. Until, of course, someone did. Madison Collins, a young documentary filmmaker obsessed with Hollywood lore, couldn't resist the pull of Karloff's legend. She had spent months researching haunted homes, sifting through archives, and interviewing former neighbors. When she learned the Karloff estate was rumored to be abandoned but intact, she knew she had to see it for herself. The moment she crossed the threshold, Madison felt a pressure in the air, like stepping underwater. Dust blanketed every surface, and the house smelled of mildew and decay, with faint hints of cigar smoke, as if the past refused to leave. The grand living room was frozen in time, with its Gothic arches and blackened fireplace. On the mantel sat a collection of framed photographs of Karloff in various roles. His hollowed eyes and monstrous grin seemed to follow her as she moved deeper into the house. Then she saw the chair. It was a tall, wingback chair with dark upholstery, positioned near a window that faced the garden. Legend had it that this was where Karloff liked to sit, reading scripts or quietly watching the sunset. But now it seemed oddly out of place, untouched by the years, with no sign of dust. Madison aimed her camera, the lens capturing the eerie perfection of the chair. Suddenly, the viewfinder flickered, and for a split second, a shadow darted across the room. She whipped around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Shaking it off as nerves, she continued exploring. Upstairs, the master bedroom was locked. A faint sound emanated from behind the door, a rhythmic creaking, like the rocking of a chair. Her pulse quickened as she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was icy. The rocking chair in the corner moved slowly back and forth, though no one sat in it. The room was otherwise untouched. A bed neatly made, curtains drawn, and Karloff's initials engraved on the brass of a bedside lamp. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence. "Why have you come?" Madison froze. The voice was deep, gravelly, unmistakably British. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, the camera trembling in her hands. There was no one there. The door slammed shut. Panicking, she ran to the window and tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped further, her breath now visible in the dim light. A shadow appeared in the corner of the room, coalescing into a tall figure. Madison gasped. It was him, Boris Karloff, or what was left of him. His face was gaunt, his sunken eyes glimmering with an otherworldly light. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. His voice wasn't angry, but filled with a sorrow so deep it made her knees buckle. "Why?" Madison stammered. "This house, it holds more than my shadow. It holds them." Before she could ask what he meant, the walls began to groan. The sound of dragging footsteps echoed from the hallway. The door burst open, revealing nothing but darkness. But Madison could feel them cold, grasping hands reaching for her from the void. Screaming, she bolted past the door, her camera slipping from her grasp and crashing to the floor. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for air. When she looked back, the house was silent. The window where the chair sat now glowed faintly, and she could just make out the silhouette of Karloff, watching her leave. Madison never retrieved her camera, and the footage was lost. She tried to tell her story, but few believed her. Weeks later, a new documentary crew arrived to investigate the house. They didn't last the night. The chair was found in the garden the next morning, upright and dust-free, as if waiting for its next visitor. As Madison sped away from the Karloff house that night, her mind raced with fragments of what she had seen and heard. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, but how do you explain the impossible? By the time she reached her small apartment in Echo Park, her adrenaline had waned, replaced by an uneasy exhaustion. She locked the door behind her, double-checking it out of habit, and flung herself onto the couch. Her laptop sat on the coffee table, her half-written documentary proposal glowing on the screen. She stared at it, her hands trembling. What if no one believed her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud. She froze. It came from her kitchen. The apartment was small, and the kitchen was just steps away. Slowly, she stood and approached, her heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time, a distinct knock, like something tapping against the inside of the pantry door. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase, and crept forward. With one hand, she yanked the pantry door open. Nothing, just cans of soup and boxes of cereal. Exhaling in relief, she stepped back only to hear another knock. This time it was coming from her front door. Her skin prickled as she approached the peephole. She expected to see a delivery driver or perhaps her neighbor, but instead, she saw no one. The hallway outside was empty, bathed in flickering light from the broken bulb. Then, just as she was about to step back, she heard it. A voice, low, gravelly, and unmistakably familiar. "You shouldn't have come." Madison's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, clutching the vase, but the apartment was still empty. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, making her jump. She grabbed it, desperate for a distraction, only to see a notification, unknown device connected. Her heart sank. She didn't have a smart home system or anything that should trigger such a message. The phone buzzed again. Camera connected. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Her camera was still in the Karloff house. The app for her camera's feed opened automatically, and the screen filled with static. Slowly, shapes began to emerge. A dimly lit room. The unmistakable Gothic arches of the Karloff living room. Someone or something was holding the camera. The image wavered as the unseen figure carried it through the house, past the fireplace, up the stairs. The feed cut in and out, each burst of clarity revealing more of the decaying interior. Madison's hands shook as she realized where it was headed. The master bedroom. The door creaked open on the screen. For a moment, everything was still. Then the camera tilted down, focusing on the rocking chair. It was empty. The feed flickered again, and the chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there now, its face obscured, head tilted as if staring straight at the lens. It leaned forward slowly, revealing Karloff's gaunt, hollowed visage. His lips didn't move, but his voice came through the speakers clearly. "You've brought them with you." The screen went black. Before Madison could react, her phone screen turned into a mirror-like reflection of her face. Behind her, faintly, a shadow moved. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Madison's stomach dropped as the shadow in her phone's reflection grew sharper, closer. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt anchored in place. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the movement. Nothing. The room was silent, empty except for the faint hum of her refrigerator. She was alone, or so it seemed. Her phone buzzed again in her trembling hand. This time it was a notification, new recording saved. With hesitant fingers, she tapped on the notification, and the video began to play. It was a grainy clip, as if filmed on an ancient reel-to-reel camera. The timestamp at the bottom flickered erratically, but the setting was unmistakable. It was her living room. The video showed Madison herself, standing frozen just moments earlier, staring at her phone. Behind her, the shadow was back. But this time it didn't just move, it expanded, curling upward and outward, like smoke reaching for the ceiling. And then, impossibly, it coalesced into a shape. The figure was tall and indistinct, more an outline of darkness than a solid form. It loomed behind her, its movements deliberate, predatory. In the video, Madison's recorded self began to turn, just as she had moments ago. But before she completed the motion, the shadow lunged. The screen cut to black. Madison dropped the phone with a gasp, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She looked around the room again, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She knew the house she had left behind in the Hollywood Hills was cursed, but now it felt like that curse had followed her, hitching a ride on her fear. Her phone vibrated again, sliding across the coffee table. A new message appeared on the screen. "Don't look behind you." Every hair on her body stood on end. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but follow the message's sinister instruction. But curiosity, or perhaps some darker compulsion, pulled at her. Slowly, against her better judgment, she turned her head. The room was bathed in its usual dim light. Nothing seemed out of place until she noticed the chair. Her armchair, which had been pushed neatly against the far wall, was now in the center of the room. Sitting upright as though waiting, Madison backed away, her breaths shallow and rapid. A chill swept over her as she realized something else. The chair wasn't hers. It was the chair from the Karloff house. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. Could someone have moved it? Was she losing her grip on reality? But the longer she stared, the more undeniable it became. The intricate stitching, the worn armrests, she had seen it up close, photographed it. And now it was here. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Sit." Madison's blood ran cold. Her fingers hovered over the phone, tempted to throw it across the room. But her eyes were drawn to the chair. Its presence seemed to fill the room, a gravity pulling her toward it. The air grew heavier, colder. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shadows on the walls begin to writhe, as though alive. A deep, guttural noise rumbled through the room, a voice, ancient and hollow, yet eerily familiar. "You opened the door. Now it won't close." Madison's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head. The voice wasn't just in the room, it was in her mind, echoing, layering on itself like an endless loop. Images flashed before her eyes. The Karloff house, the rocking chair, the shadowed figure sitting motionless, watching. And then something new. A hallway she didn't recognize, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper and scorch marks. At the end of the corridor stood a single door, slightly ajar, pale light spilling out from the cracks. The voice grew louder, almost deafening. "You must come back." When Madison opened her eyes, she was no longer in her apartment. She was standing in that hallway. The door at the end creaked open wider, beckoning her forward. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. As her trembling hand reached for the door, the light inside dimmed, and a familiar shadow began to take shape beyond the threshold. And then, just as her fingertips brushed the wood, the door slammed shut. A voice behind her whispered, soft but unmistakable, "Welcome home." Madison spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. The hallway behind her was impossibly long now, stretching into a void where walls flickered in and out of existence. The voice, soft, sinister, seemed to echo from every direction, as though the house itself was speaking to her. "Did you think you could leave it behind?" Her breathing grew shallow, panic clawing at her chest. She stumbled backward, her back pressing against the locked door. She could feel it pulsing, almost breathing, as if something alive waited on the other side. The hallway began to shift, the walls closing in, narrowing like a throat swallowing her whole. Frames hung crooked on the walls, their contents warped and twisted. One photo caught her eye, a sepia-toned image of Boris Karloff sitting in his infamous chair. His piercing gaze directed not at the camera, but at her. The chair was empty. Madison tore her eyes away, only to realize the hallway had transformed. The scorch marks on the walls had deepened, oozing black tar that dripped and sizzled as it hit the floor. The air smelled of burnt wood and rot, thick and suffocating. Then she heard it again, the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. It came from somewhere ahead of her, a steady back and forth sound that seemed to grow louder with each breath. The hallway seemed to urge her forward, the floor tilting subtly as if to spill her toward whatever lay ahead. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out with trembling hands, its screen glowing faintly. Another notification. Recording live. The app opened itself, the video feed jittering with static before resolving into an image. She recognized the scene instantly. It was the same hallway she now stood in, but from a vantage point just behind her. Madison froze. The screen showed her standing still, phone in hand, while behind her, something began to emerge from the darkened walls. At first, it was only a faint outline, like smoke curling into a humanoid shape. But then, the shadow began to solidify: long limbs, hollow eyes, and a face that flickered between features like a candle about to snuff out. It wasn't just behind her in the video. It was behind her. Madison's breath hitched. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating void that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The phone screen crackled as the shadow leaned closer, its formless mouth whispering something she couldn't hear. The video feed glitched, and for a split second, the image of the hallway was replaced with another. The living room of the Karloff house. The wingback chair sat in its usual place, but now Madison could see her camera resting on the floor in front of it, tilted upward. A figure stood over the camera. It wasn't Karloff. It was her. Her doppelganger stared down at the lens, a cold, vacant expression on her face. Slowly, the duplicate turned its head toward the chair and smiled, as though acknowledging something unseen. The rocking chair in the feed began to move again, its creaking rhythmic and deliberate. The screen went black. Madison dropped the phone, the sound of its impact echoing unnaturally loud in the suffocating hallway. She finally turned, unable to resist any longer. The shadow was gone, but in its place the hallway had changed again. It was no longer empty. At least a dozen figures stood silently, their forms half submerged in the walls, as though the house itself was consuming them. Their faces were pale, expressionless, their mouths frozen open in silent screams. The rocking chair's creak now seemed to echo from all directions, faster, more frantic, like a heartbeat spiraling out of control. Then, all at once, the figures moved. Their heads snapped toward her in unison, and as their lifeless eyes locked onto hers, a single voice rang out, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud. "You brought them here. Finish what you started." The door behind her swung open violently, spilling pale, flickering light into the hall. Madison felt herself being pulled toward it, her feet sliding across the warped floor as an invisible force dragged her closer. She clawed at the walls, desperate to resist, but the door yawned wider, revealing the same garden from the Karloff house. Only now, the garden was wrong. Its flowers withered, its trees gnarled and blackened, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky. And in the center of the garden sat the chair, empty, yet impossibly commanding. A low, guttural growl came from the doorway, followed by Karloff's voice, cold and final. "Take your place, or they will take it for you." The pull grew stronger, and Madison felt herself slipping, her body halfway through the door. She reached out, trying to grab anything to stop her descent into the unnatural abyss. But the shadows were already closing in. Madison screamed as the invisible force yanked her fully through the doorway and into the corrupted garden. The air was thick and cold, weighing on her chest like an anchor. She stumbled to her feet, her eyes darting to the rocking chair in the center of the garden. It seemed to exude a presence, a gravitational pull that demanded her attention. "Take your place," the voice repeated, deeper now, reverberating through her very bones. The garden felt alive, shifting around her. The trees twisted and writhed, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The flowers on the ground were no longer flowers but distorted faces, their mouths opening and closing silently as if gasping for air. Madison backed away, her heart racing. "I don't belong here. I didn't do anything," she cried, her voice trembling. The shadows around the garden swirled, forming shapes that coalesced into figures. They were the same as the ones she had seen in the hallway, pale, lifeless, their mouths frozen in silent screams. But now they moved, stepping closer, encircling her. One figure broke away from the group, moving with an eerie, jerking gait. Its head tilted unnaturally as it approached her. Madison's breath hitched as she recognized its face. It was her own, twisted and hollow, its eyes black voids that reflected nothing. "You let us in," the doppelganger hissed, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "Now you'll stay with us." Madison shook her head violently. "No, this isn't real." The doppelganger smiled, a grotesque, unnatural stretch of the lips. Oh, it's real. You just didn't understand the price. Behind her, the rocking chair began to creak again, its rhythmic motion filling the air. Madison turned to see that it was no longer empty. Boris Karloff sat there now, his gaunt, shadowed face watching her intently. His eyes glinted with something ancient and malevolent. "The house chooses," he intoned, his voice calm yet filled with a chilling authority. "You crossed the threshold, and now you are part of it. The others will rest. You will take their place." The figures around her began to dissolve into the air, their pale forms collapsing into streams of black smoke. The smoke swirled, converging on Madison, wrapping around her legs and arms. She fought against it, clawing at the tendrils, but they were cold and unyielding. The rocking chair creaked louder and faster, its motion now erratic. Karloff's form blurred, becoming less human and more like the shadowy presence she had first seen in the hallway. "Sit," he commanded, his voice booming. Madison's body was dragged forward, her feet skidding against the cracked earth of the garden. She screamed and flailed, trying to resist, but the tendrils of smoke lifted her, carrying her toward the chair. "Please, I didn't mean to, I just wanted to." "And now you will," Karloff interrupted, his voice echoing. Madison was dropped into the chair, her body freezing in place as if she were made of stone. The moment she sat, the garden fell silent. The air shifted, heavy and still. The shadows retreated, the pale light fading until only darkness surrounded her. And yet, she could still see her body, motionless, and Karloff standing before her. "The house always needs a keeper," he said, leaning close to her face. "You've earned the honor." Madison tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her limbs refused to move. She could only watch as her reflection, the doppelganger, stepped forward, smiling. "You'll do beautifully," it said, before turning and walking toward the house. The last thing Madison saw before everything faded was the Karloff house, its windows glowing faintly, the shadows inside moving as though alive. Somewhere deep within, the rocking chair creaked, steady and endless. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.